Mr. Clark here. We're going to go through a review of the Vietnam War. What you're going to do is we go through the review. You're going to fill out the PowerPoint topic review sheet that I posted in Google Classroom. I might suggest that you have one document open on, let's say, your computer, and you play the PowerPoint on your phone or vice versa. That way you can see both simultaneously. Some of you like to maybe split your screen. You can do it that way as well. Kind of up to you. Also, this is posted on YouTube, so for some reason you have YouTube that streams on your TV, you could always just play it on your TV as well. All right. So as we go through the questions, you'll notice that pretty much there'll be one question or so for each slide. Some slides do not have a question, but I'll point out some of the answers as we go through it. So the first thing we're kind of looking at are the two leaders, respectively, of North and South Vietnam. First, we had the leader of South Vietnam. He was the Democratic leader, somewhat brutal to his people. Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem. Make sure you know how to pronounce it as well. And then the communist leader of North Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh. Where's Vietnam? So you can see the overview map there, and then kind of has a little square that's around the area in Southeast Asia where Vietnam is located. And then you can see in the yellow area there, it's kind of a narrow country that borders the southeastern corner of Asia. So when you think about the United States, why in the world do we even go to Vietnam? That's kind of a question a lot of Americans and historians kind of reflect back on and say, especially as we learned about the war and the horrors and how poorly it was waged. And you kind of reflect, why did so many Americans lose their lives? Why did we spend billions of dollars there? Why did we have a draft to kind of force people into Vietnam? Well, we're dealing with a period of time in history that we know is the Cold War, and two major policies during this period of time. The policy of containment, which is the idea the United States needed to stop the spread of communism no matter what. We had already done that in Korea. We had failed previously in China when China turned communist in 1949. So in many ways, Vietnam was just another proxy war. We have the communist side supporting the North Vietnamese, Soviet Union, China kind of rooting for North Vietnam, the United States jumping in there to kind of stop the spread of communism into South Vietnam, just like we did when we went into Korea to stop the spread of communism into South Korea. Then secondly, the Truman Doctrine. President Truman in 1947 gave a speech to Congress. It was kind of dealing with the situation in Turkey and Greece. There was a lot of fear in 1947 that the Soviet Union was going to move into those two countries. So we stepped in, and Truman kind of declared that anytime a nation is trying to stop the spread of communism, we're going to step in there and we're going to do our best to try and stop that spread. Now, the country that was involved in Vietnam for a long period of time during the colonial period of time in history were the French. The Vietnam War in many ways kind of grew, and that's number 4, out of a conflict between Vietnam and France. So in July 1954, after 100 years of colonial rule, they defeated France. No surprise here, the French lost a war or a battle. It's pretty much in French history. Nationalistic forces under General von Giap defeated the Allied French troops and at the remote mountain outpost of Dien Bien Phu. And you can see the imagery there in a French poster. Next, number 5, the Geneva Peace Accords. They divided Vietnam, and you can see the map there on the right-hand side, divided it between the North and the South. And that became kind of the dividing line there. Just like we had the 38th parallel that divided North and South Korea, now we have the 17th parallel to kind of divide North and South Vietnam. North is the communist side, and the southern side is the democratic side. Somewhat from a historian standpoint, and easier to remember, in both Korea and in Vietnam, the northern side was the communist side, and the southern side, the democratic side. So at least from Asian proxy wars that the United States got involved with, we at least know North and South, communist and democratic. Opposition to the Geneva Accords. Obviously, we had a situation there where the United States had their own goals, I guess, in regard to what was going to go on in Vietnam. We always have our kind of sidebar views on what needs to be done. During that period of time, the United States and the Vietnamese, they had kind of reached an agreement that there was going to be free elections eventually. And then the United States realized that if free elections were going to be held and they could determine whether or not they wanted to be democratic or communist, that the communist side would win. So the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, thought the Geneva Accords granted too much power to the Communist Party in northern Vietnam. So that's why they kind of supported the idea that South Vietnam would be separate, and that's how South Vietnam kind of came about. Also, too, during this period of time, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, was created. Under SEATO, for political cover, the Eisenhower administration and SEATO created a idea of a democracy in South Vietnam. And this put Diem into power. So that kind of answers number 6. I mean, you could put SEATO down. It's kind of probably easier to fit, but you could also put Eisenhower down. It's kind of a Eisenhower using the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization as the means of implementing his idea of putting Ngo Dinh Diem into power into South Vietnam in hopes of preventing all of Vietnam from turning communist. In retrospect, the United States and the world might have been better just letting Ho Chi Minh take over all of Vietnam back in the 1950s, and then maybe the Vietnam War didn't occur. And as we'll see, I don't want to give the ending to the movie or the story here before we get there, but by 1975, all of Vietnam was communist anyway. So it's really just putting off the inevitable. Another reason why the United States was fearful of communism spreading into Vietnam was the domino theory, which you can put down for number 7. American policymakers developed the domino theory as a justification for getting involved around the world. The fear was if South Vietnam falls to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, and Pakistan all potentially could fall, kind of like dominoes. And you can kind of see that little visual there. Stop the first to save the rest. So we see there Korea first. We did stop Korea from completely falling to communism. But you can see there is how all the different countries could potentially fall into line. Even Australia, as it mentions at the very bottom there, could be at risk. South Vietnam under Diem. Diem was pretty much a corrupt leader. In late 1957, American military aid began a counterattack against the insurgency in his country. The help of the CIA and American money and weapons, nicknamed Operation Phoenix. They kind of identified those who thought they might, kind of start a revolution or bring down Diem, were put back by a combined effort of the United States and Diem. Diem began to crack down even further on citizens in his country. The law 10/59 made it legal to hold suspected communists in jail without bringing formal charges. You can see the gentleman imprisoned on the right. So basically began rounding up the communists, those who are anti-Diem South Vietnamese, and they were put into jail. One of the groups that really was opposed to Diem's harsh actions were the Buddhist monks. The religious leaders there began to take a hardline or strong stance against Diem's leadership. The more the forces attacked Diem's troops and secret police, the more Diem complained that the communists were trying to take South Vietnam by force. He pleaded to the United States for more help and aid. Buddhist monks took a very dramatic step to kind of bring attention to their cause. Just like Gandhi in the 1930s and 40s had protested against British leadership. And of course, he wasn't as severe as we're going to see here with the Buddhist monks. But he went on hunger strikes to kind of bring international attention to the idea that India should be independent from Great Britain. And that really served the Indian people very well. Well, the Buddhist monks thought that if they could sacrifice their own lives, and they did a very dramatic thing, and you can see the disturbing imagery there on the slide. And this is the answer for number 8. Buddhist monks set themselves on fire. This is known as self-immolation. So it's basically giving up your life for a cause. And this obviously is disturbing to see across the globe. 1961, President Kennedy is in office, sworn in January of 1961. He sent a team to Vietnam to kind of report and assess what was going on there. Report back to Kennedy's administration. It was called the White Paper. Argue for an increased military, technical, and economic aid. And for the very first time, this is the answer number 8, John F. Kennedy sent in military advisors into South Vietnam. He was kind of weighing the pros and cons of doing so as to whether or not the United States wanted to kind of tiptoe in. So when you look at the impact of the United States in Vietnam, no one president is completely responsible for an American involvement in Vietnam. You see Eisenhower getting involved during this period of time in the 1950s. Kennedy following up after Eisenhower further gets involved into Vietnam with the advisory role. American military were going in, helping out the South Vietnamese, training them, showing them how to use equipment and things like that, but no official military troops for the United States in Vietnam yet. Viet Cong successes. The culturally insensitive plan further alienated the peasants from Saigon regime, produced more recruits. So the communists are known as the Viet Cong or the National Liberation Front. By the summer of 1963, because of the Viet Cong successes and its own failures, it was clear the government of South Vietnam was on the very verge of collapse. By late September, the Buddhist protests had created such discontent in the South that the Kennedy administration actually supported an overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem. You can see in 1963, some of Diem's own generals approached the American embassy in Saigon with plans to overthrow Diem. With Washington's approval, Diem and his brother were captured and later assassinated. If you look at the photograph up top right corner, a little bit disturbing. That's Ngo Dinh Diem. He actually became Ngo Diem dead. You can see there as these dead bodies in that particular photograph. Sadly enough, in the same month where Ngo Dinh Diem was assassinated, President Kennedy was assassinated later on in November of 1963. So with the change in the American leadership, is going to change in somewhat of American policy. Lyndon Baines Johnson, pictured there, became the new president of the United States of America. LBJ was dealing with the continuing problems coming out of Vietnam. American ships were now surrounding and in the waters around Vietnam. And in August of 1964, in response to American and South Vietnamese espionage along its coast, North Vietnam launched an attack against the Seed Turner Joy and the USS Maddox, 2 American ships, which were positioned in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just off the coast of North Vietnam. First attack on August 2nd, 1964. Second attack supposedly took place on August 4th. American authorities eventually concluded that the second attack did not take place, but that's what was reported back to the media and the president. This led to, which is number 11, the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. You read about this as you were working on your document-based essays, and this is kind of one of the turning points in the entire war. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed nearly unanimously in Congress. I think 2 members of the House of Reps voted against it. They gave President Johnson what is called unchecked war powers, meaning that President Johnson can do whatever he wished in regard to waging war. He can escalate, commit troops, do whatever was necessary for American involvement in Vietnam. And this led to a great expansion of American involvement there. And there's the Gulf of Tonkin located right there. And so you have North Vietnam here. Okay, when you look at the questions here, question 12, the North Vietnamese communists are also known as the Viet Cong. They began to attack into South Vietnam, and so President Johnson ordered what is known as Operation Rolling Thunder, which is what you put down for number 13. It was a basically carpet bombing of North Vietnam, just bombs dropped indiscriminately on a number of different places. One of the biggest challenges the American military had was finding the enemy in North Vietnam. Very dense jungles in North Vietnam made it very difficult to even find the enemy. So what we began to use were 2 chemicals, Agent Orange and napalm, which is what you put down for number 14. This allowed for the United States to basically incinerate tree coverage in some of the jungle to allow for us to better see our enemy. Operation Ranch Hand, which is kind of the nickname for this process. It's kind of a defoliation program to kind of incinerate the jungle. The unfortunate aspect was the deadly chemical cocktail contained dioxin, which killed off millions of acres of jungle to try and weaken the Viet Cong or the Vietnamese communists, but left a horrendous legacy in Vietnam. The dioxin got deep into the food chain, into the water supply, into the crops. And as a result, there are hundreds and hundreds, sometimes people even estimate maybe thousands of birth defects and deformities. And you see disturbing imagery down the bottom there of people who were born with deformed legs and issues that really complicated their lives for their entire life. Helicopters during this period of time were being used extensively. They would drop platoons into the jungle. They would help to clear things out. There were also the ambulances that would airlift you out of a war zone. How did the North Vietnamese fight back against U.S. invaders? Well, they really used kind of a strategy of hit and run. This is also known as guerrilla warfare, which we put down for 15. They basically were on the move. They would attack Americans from the jungle and then go back and hide back within their communities. Very often they were just dressed as regular villagers, and then it would be very difficult for the American military to tell enemy from friend versus foe or enemy versus friend. North Vietnamese tactics. In areas held by the NLF, the communists distributed the land to peasants, basically trying to buy some support. The United States, too, was dealing with a lot of different issues as they were moving throughout the jungles. There's a lot of primitive ways they got back to us. A lot of booby traps where they can fall into like a pit, or they would have bamboo kind of spears hit with poison, or even sometimes excrement that was on there, and then that would get into your body and that would promote infection. So they used a lot of primitive things to get back at the United States. The Vietnamese, too, they had extensive tunnel system where they actually were underground very often. It was very difficult to find. They would camouflage their entrances. You can see here would be one of the spots which would have been a camouflaged area where potentially an American troop or troops would step onto and fall in. You can see this little spears down the bottom there, and that would impale and kill the American soldiers. 16 search and destroy missions. We actually sent in our platoons in an attempt to clear out the Vietnamese troops. Often this led to the burning down of entire villages. One of the disturbing quotes coming out of the war, as one Marine said, if they weren't Viet Cong before we got there, meaning the Vietnamese communists, they sure as heck were by the time we left. So many innocent Vietnamese were killed in the process. After Operation Rolling Thunder, the Communist Party moved to a protracted war strategy. The idea was to get the United States bogged down into a war they could not win. They just had to run out the clock, basically create a situation where eventually American troops just simply had to leave. Anti-war sentiments in the United States as the death counts mounted. And what was really different about the Vietnam War is that it was playing out on TV. So the casualties, the body bags, the Americans coming home, we saw a lot of that play out on TV. Anti-war protests, they erupted on college campuses. I don't know if I mentioned 17, but that was the draft during this period of time. Obviously, as we were short on troops, we had to begin to bring more and more Americans into the military. And that was another thing that kind of helped fuel anti-war protests. A lot of times the age groups on college campuses were those who potentially could be drafted. So they had the most to lose by having to comply with the draft notifications. Two sides began to develop during this period of time, the Hawks and the Dubs. Hawks are those who supported the war, the Dubs who were against it. So 19 is Hawks and 20 is Dubs. In 1968, the Democrats were looking to run a new candidate. Originally, Johnson was going to run for re-election, but the war had taken such a toll on his presidency that after winning one of the early primaries, and you watch the primaries play out here in 2020 a little bit between the Democrats. So basically, Johnson lost the very first primary in New Hampshire, realizing that maybe he was not going to be the nominee, and the Vietnam War was taking such a toll on his presidency. He dropped out. when he lost to Eugene McCarthy. Then Robert Kennedy jumped in. Kennedy was then assassinated after winning the California primary. And that led to like a brokered convention where they didn't know who really was going to be the nominee. There's a lot of protest outside the convention in Chicago, and eventually they settled on Hubert H. Humphrey, who was at that time the current vice president of the United States, as the nominee to take on Richard Nixon. And as you know, Nixon's going to win that election. So 21 is the Democratic National Convention. 22, Tet Offensive. In late January 1968, we saw a situation where the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched coordinated attacks against many different points in the South. These attacks were eventually put back, but the damage was done, both to our troops and also to the credibility of the Johnson administration, in the sense that we were starting to realize for the first time in 1968 that maybe we would not win this war. Further contributing to bad press in America was the My Lai massacre in March of 1968. Hushed up at the time, they tried to cover it up, but eventually it came out after a journalist was able to uncover that the United States had slaughtered 400 men, women, and children who were not combatants. They were just living in a village. You could see some of the bodies there in the grasslands there in Vietnam. This brought obviously more opposition towards the war. In late March 68, as I mentioned before, Johnson announced that he was not going to seek or run for re-election. And the negotiations began to move forward to try and potentially end the war. That was during the Johnson administration. And then Nixon came in. He said he had a secret plan to end the war. This is kind of coming out during Nixon's campaign. He was going to turn over a lot of the fighting to the South Vietnamese against the North Vietnamese. This is called Vietnamization. You put that down for 24. So basically, we would train and supply the South Vietnamese as best we could, and eventually we would kind of cut and run. Unfortunately, Nixon went back on his promise almost instantaneously. Shortly into the Nixon presidency in 1969, the United States began to expand the campaign into neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia, which we put down for 25. Protests, of course, erupted even further after seeing Nixon go back on his promise. By April 1970, the protests were across the country on virtually every college campus. 26, at Kent State in Ohio, 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen. Basically, the protest was really large in the campus. The National Guard was sent in to kind of break the protest up. And you can see in the background of the photo, they kind of began to move forward along that long open field there, and somebody for some reason opened fire. Nobody knows why, and they began just firing into the crowd of students. Ended up killing 4, including the unfortunate victim there in the photograph. Jackson State, another university in Mississippi, saw a student shot and killed, and the mother to cry. They were killing our babies in Vietnam and even here in our own backyard. 27 is the Christmas bombings. In December 1972, the Nixon administration unleashed a series of deadly bombing raids against targets in North Vietnam's largest cities, Hanoi and Haiphong. These attacks, known as the Christmas bombings, brought immediate condemnation from the international community and forced the Nixon administration to kind of reconsider its tactics. In early January 1973, Nixon convinced Saigon they would not abandon South Vietnam if they signed the peace treaty. So basically, we signed a separate peace treaty to pull the United States troops out of the war. So make sure you get down the Paris Peace Agreement for 28. And the Paris Agreement did not end the conflict, as the South Vietnamese had to continue to fight against North Vietnam without American forces. Newspaper headlines in the United States, certainly after the Paris Peace Agreement was signed. From March of 1973 until the fall of Saigon, and the number 29, you put down April 30th, 1975. So the South Vietnamese continued to fight North Vietnam, but eventually they lost. The war finally came to an end. The North Vietnamese had won, and all of Vietnam became communist. So this was a failure of the policy of containment. It was a failure of leadership on part of the United States in multiple presidencies. Neither political party was innocent, as Johnson was a Democrat. Nixon was a Republican, so both Democrats and Republicans are to blame for the debacle that was the Vietnam War. It's the longest and most unpopular war in the history of our country, although the war in Afghanistan has turned out to be a little bit longer than Vietnam in retrospect. 58,000 Americans died during the Vietnam War. The United States spent $200 billion on the war. So 30s 58,000, 31 200 billion. Another 34,000 were wounded. I mean, my error, 304,000 wounded, of which 75,000 were severely disabled. 61% of all men killed were 21 years or younger. The oldest man killed, one of the generals, was 62. These are some of the imageries you saw that kind of moved the public against the war. Also during this period of time, and this is 32, the counterculture really was very impactful. The baby boom generation of Americans who protested the war became known as hippies, who were part of the counterculture, which you put down for 32. Many of these counterculture Americans lived in self-sufficient shared communities where they grew crops, took care of each other. And this is number 33. They lived in communes. Woodstock, hippies gathered at this iconic concert. See the photograph there in August of 1969. Some of the most famous musicians in the history of the United States performed here. So when you reflect back on the overall war itself, and this is the very final question, which is 35, you could choose the three you feel are most impactful. There's more than three. So as we go through it, if you see a strong one, I would suggest writing it down. So for the United States, we underestimated the tenacity, the organization of the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front. Despite dropping more tonnage of explosives on Vietnam than the entire amount in World War II itself, the Americans could not stop the movement of troops or supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. See the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it's in the black outline there. It's basically going through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia. And until Nixon came in 1969, we were afraid to kind of go into that area and bomb that trail. So as a result, in some ways, they were able to move freely through the neighboring countries without American involvement for most of the war. The North Vietnamese conducted a people's war in which everyone played a part, whether it be local villagers, the government. At first, most Americans supported the war, but by 1970, the peace movement, protest movement had support from all parts of society. The government could no longer ignore it. The movement against the war was greater than the government could hold back. After 1969, there were deep questions about the efficiency of the United States troops. There was a serious drug problem within the American military. Morale in the country was low. Many troops were time servers, meaning that they were forced to go to the war. And as soon as they got into the war itself, they were just counting down the days until they could go back home. The United States never really truly understood the culture of the Vietnamese people. They weren't interested in American culture, Coca-Cola, chewing gum, things like that. America was not prepared to keep losing high numbers of soldiers, and the casualty numbers kind of just piled up. And this jungle warfare was something we were not well suited for. Hopefully you enjoyed the review here of the Vietnam War. You guys did a nice job on your projects. So this kind of ties everything together that we saw and read through. Obviously, the projects were designed to see them in class, but based on the circumstances that were unforeseen, you had to basically go through them on your own, most of them. So this hopefully relates all those ideas together and you have a good understanding of the Vietnam War. Mr. Clark's out. See ya.